No.
Up.
Editing.
Oh, okay, there's a signal, that's nice. Alright, we'll work with that for the time being. And we will pull that up and you see. Great. So, good afternoon, thank you for your patience. My name is Sten Ternström, I'm from Stockholm, Sweden. And I'm trained an engineer, but I'm fascinated with the voice. And one of the things that engineers like to do is to measure, right? And so what are we going to measure? Well, we can measure the things that the previous speakers have been talking about, how big things are and how much airflow there is. But of course, it would be nice if we could tell a lot of things about the voice by just looking at the microphone signal, because everybody can afford a microphone, right? And so if we look at the microphone signal when I'm talking, like so, and perhaps also, well, let's think about what we're seeing here. If I go, that just makes a white, what we call more or less a white noise, right? And what is white noise? Well, it's sound at all frequencies. So let's have a look at that. And then when I say something like ah, you can see there's something periodic going on, something repeating. And so we can suspect that since the vocal folds are moving in a repeating fashion, then those repetitions there have something to do with the vocal folds. Fascinating. Right. Now, if I were able to do just one pulse, what would that look like? Could you see that? It passes very quickly, but it's like I give a little impulse to the mass of air in my vocal tract, and it goes boing, sort of resonates, rather like a piece of tubing like this. If I go, I can align that. Pretty cool. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, when my vocal folds are closing, the air is on its way out, but when they close, there's a sort of a jerk, because suddenly the flow stops when the vocal folds close. And that jerk is what we call an excitation. It's rather like, right? So actually when I'm doing, we're seeing all those little excitations. If I freeze it, we see a negative pulse there going down, and then there's some sort of ringing. And the negative pulse is because when the vocal folds close, as Ron just told us, there is a rarefaction, there is a negative pressure. And that's why that thing goes to minus, because the microphone is giving us the pressure. And then the vocal folds are closed, and the air then goes in my vocal tract and gives us this ringing. So it's a resonance, and just as if I were doing this. Okay? And if we look at that, it doesn't always look like that. If I go thank you. And there's that, and I have to start it again. Now if I go up in pitch, you see the repetitions are much more frequent, obviously, because the vocal folds are vibrating much faster. If we look at the spectrum, that's what we have over here. So what's the spectrum? Well, you can see it looks very confusing. Lots of little yellow things going up and down. So let's try to keep this simple. We'll just do the simplest possible wave shape that we can have. And what's that? Sine wave, yay! And why is the sine wave the simplest possible wave shape? Well, if you imagine a circle turning round and round, it's kind of the simplest periodic thing you can think of. And if we look at the circle and spread it out in time and watch it create a spiral, that's a sine wave. So the sine wave is a spiral seen sideways. You can make almost a sine wave with your voice. If you make a very closed vowel, you can make a purer sine wave by whistling. And what we see here is that on the horizontal axis we have frequency. Can you read those numbers? No. It says 1500 here, so I was whistling at 1500 hertz. And on the vertical scale we have decibels, with 10 decibels per step here. So I can measure not only how loud the tone is, but also the frequency. So that's what we call the frequency transform of the signal on the left. Okay? So we can measure how loud the sine wave is, and we can measure the frequency of it. Now we could do that over here as well, because of course we measure how quickly it repeats as well. So this over here is the time domain, and this is the frequency domain, and those two things are something you will hear a lot about in the week to come. Alright, so now I will ask all of you to whistle and see what happens in the graph on the left. So the wonderful thing is that we can actually see many sine waves at the same time, right? And so that what happens now if I make a periodic sound with my voice? Good heavens. We have a lot of sine waves there, don't we? And notice that we have on the frequency scale here, we have the first, or the fundamental harmonic. These are all the overtones, the harmonics, or partial tones. We've got three different names for the same thing. How annoying. All right. So overtones are typically all the harmonics except the first, which we call the fundamental. But they're all partial tones. So this is partial tone number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and so on. And notice that the fundamental here is not the strongest one. In fact, the strongest harmonic here is number 4. So why don't we hear that frequency? That's sort of strange, isn't it? If I go, ah, you'd think we would hear the ah, 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 ah. That's the frequency we should be hearing. But no, our ear is very clever. It detects the repetition frequency of the waveform, regardless of how strong the partials are. You might also wonder, why don't we hear the harmonics? Well, we'll come to that in a little moment. So let's see if I can just park that there and push this fellow down and continue to the next slide. We're now going to do a little synthesis experiment. You're going to run a synthesizer, and this is a synthesizer that you can play with yourselves. It's freely downloadable, and if you're interested, you can come to me and ask. So now I'm going to... Okay, now you've lost my voice because I've connected it to the synthesizer. So but let's see what happens with that. Although I should be able to put out my voice at the same time. La 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 la. And that would be this one perhaps. Yeah, all right, so now you hear me as well. How clever. Okay, so let's play a sine wave. There it is. And this little interface is such that I can control the sine wave. Like that. And now if I play double the frequency, I get the octave. Okay? Or if I play 3 times the frequency, sorry, it's a bit fiddly. Where is it? So you notice that down here we see the strongest harmonic and we see the others that are not quite 0. But now what happens if we start adding these together? That's what we call additive synthesis. So here's a sine wave. We add twice the frequency at the same phase. And then I keep doing that. That's kind of cool. Did you notice that the waveform changed from a sine wave to something else? What did it look like? A sawtooth. Yes, and in fact we call it a sawtooth. And the sawtooth is practical for this purpose because it's not that different from the its spectrum is rather similar to that of the voice source. It's you remember Ron said that the spectrum of the voice source was boring. And we can see here that in fact it is, because it's just a strong fundamental and it goes down. There is one aspect of this which is very, I think, reduced that a little bit. This spectrum has really only 2 properties. One is how loud is the signal, and the other is the spectrum slope. So what do we mean by the spectrum slope? Well, I can tilt the spectrum, listen. And let's still have a look at what it looks like. Did you notice how the sound became softer? But the fundamental did not change. It's still as strong as it was. And if we lift this thing up again, it becomes buzzier and buzzier. And this, in fact, is exactly what happens when we go from soft to loud and back again in our voice. And to make this even clearer, we can change the frequency scale here and make it into a log frequency scale, and then the slope concept becomes very clear. See? That's what happens when we change the spectrum slope. And in fact, this is crucial in music. If you listen to Pavarotti on the radio, you can tell that he's singing loud, right? Now what happens if you turn down the volume on the radio? Does it sound as if he's singing softly? No. You can still tell that he's singing loud, except that the volume is down. And how does that work? Well, it's because when he sings loudly, the spectrum is raised up like this. The spectrum slope is not steep, okay? But when you go soft, the spectrum drops down. And I'd be more than happy to demonstrate that even with my own voice. Let's see if that works. Go back to the... okay. And now, switch. Hello, where did you go? There we are. Thank you. So if I go from especially in the low end of the spectrum. As I go louder, everything comes up, but the higher frequencies come up more, right? So the spectrum is doing this. And this is really important when we analyze voice, because it means that we're going to get different spectra depending on how loud we make people do the voices. And very often when people make, for example, average spectra voices, they forget to say how loud it was. And then we don't know what the slope means. So please always, when you make your experiments, always calibrate the sound pressure level so that we can compare to what other people did. Now, let's see what happens when we add a vocal tract to the vocal folds. If we have, yes, we're going to skip that because we don't have time. We love to make models as engineers. I'm fortunate to be in the possession of a set of models from Japan. This is Professor Takayuki Arai of Sofia University, and in fact he will be pleased to ship you a set of models like this as well. So this is the model of the vocal folds. It's just a little reed. And in fact, if you were to tell me to say ah, and then chop off my head just above the vocal folds, then it would sound a bit like that. It would sound pretty much like and not like ah. But when we add a tube, we get something else. Right. So this, of course, is typical of what engineers do. They take something very complicated and then they cheat and describe it as something very simple. So I'm not saying that the vocal tract looks like a straight cylinder. It really doesn't. What does the vocal tract look like? It looks like this. Okay? So there's this, you've got the vocal folds here and it's much thinner down here. And then it comes out here, and then this is the space between the tongue and the hard palate. So it's sort of flat up there, and thin there like a cobra poised to strike. Okay. So, but the acoustics, if we're not too picky, are not too different from this. And if I try to make my vocal tract as cylindrical as I can, it sounds like a tube, right? And you can get other tubes here, as you can see, to produce different vowels. So when we move our tongue, we actually are moving a constriction inside the tube. And Professor Arai kindly provides such a thing. So if I do for example. Okay, so why can't dogs speak? Well, the dogs can't speak because they can't adjust their vocal tract as much as we can. The humans and practically all mammals have very much the same machine. We saw rabbits. Ron showed us rabbit vocal folds. It's very similar across all the mammals, but humans have a much better control system for this machine than most animals do. Probably because dogs don't have all that much to say to each other. Otherwise, they would probably also have evolved some means of talking. Okay, so let's see, what is a resonance? How do we know whether or not a given object has a resonance? Well, we hit it. And then we listen. And if it says bong or ping, it has a resonance, right? Bong or ping, or if you strike a glass or a tuning fork, in fact, is a resonator. And if it says more like or something like that, then there's not as much resonance. And if it just says puck or click, like there's not much resonance there. Now that doesn't sound very scientific, so I'm going to say the same thing again. Formal procedure characterized the guitar in partners, yes. And there we go. And this is the sort of thing you read in the journal articles, but it really means what I just said in the previous slide. Right, so let's try to make a resonance analysis here. Do we have time for that? Maybe let's take the time for that. That's sort of fun. And I will do that. And here we have a little thing. Now I will play through these butchered headphones a sine wave that is sweeping from low frequency to high frequency. And if God is willing, we will see a graph of what comes. So that's when I just put the microphone right next to the headphone. And the frequency response, you can see there, it's not terribly even, but it's not too bad. All right, now what I will do is I will add the tube. Like this. I've practiced this several times. It might not work anyway. So what we see here is that some frequencies pass more easily through the tube than others, right? Because we get this greater amplitude in this, what we call the transfer function of this system. And so each of these peaks here corresponds to a resonance in the tube. And we have exactly the same thing when we analyze our voices. So let's go back and see how that relates to here. It's not as nice and clear, but you can see that there seems to be some sort of a peak here, and another there, and a third there, and a fourth there, and if with experience you can tell that there's a fifth one there. And then something funny happens, there's a big dip here, and then it carries on up here. Now, because this is a periodic sound, we get these harmonics. But if I were able to do a like that, we wouldn't see any harmonics. You see? So what I can do is I can make very low frequency by phonating on the inhale. Past my resting experimental level, down to the bottom, and now in. You see my second resonance moving up and down? Yeah. Here. Of course, the others are also moving up and down. Anyway, so this is very clever because if we make a systematic examination of that, it turns out that every combination of the first two resonant frequencies, or formant frequencies as we call them, correspond to a particular vowel. U, A, E, I, and so on. And when we look at the higher resonances, the third, fourth, and fifth, they are more related to who you are. So if I push my larynx up very high, I sound as if I were a short person. I'm trying to keep the same pitch. You see what I'm saying, right? And if I drop my larynx and still try to keep the same pitch, I have a much darker sound like a taller person. And that's because this tube has become longer, and so the resonant frequencies have come down. So my light is still green. I'm not sure it should be. I'm going to skip that. This is what I want to show you. So here's the spectrum from the voice source, the sound coming out of the vocal folds. Here is the transfer function of the tube with those resonances that we measured for this particular tube. And then this is what comes out. So some harmonics become strong and others don't become strong. Okay? And the funny thing is that our ear is extremely good at interpreting where these peaks are. So that reveals to us not only which vowel somebody is saying, but also who is saying it. Very convenient. And then, as you will learn over the week here, singers have different ways of doing that. So let's conclude this by trying to build a singer's voice by going back to the additive synthesis slide. Let's see if we can find that very quickly. I'm going to escape out of that. And we're going to do, oh, there it is. So here we are, and we go back to the synthesizer, and then that means I have to voice up again. There we go. So you can hear me. Right, now, so let's start with what we just had, and we build up the spectrum like that. And are we able to look at it? Yes, we are. Brilliant. And now, if I add resonances to this, we will hear something else. So there's the first formant. We can see it ringing. That's the resonance of the first formant at 555 Hertz in this case. Now we've added a second resonance, and we can keep going. If we raise the pitch, will it sound like a woman? Not really. Not the kind of woman I'd be interested in. So what's the problem? It turns out that females have, of course, shorter vocal tracts than men, so we're going to have to scale up all these resonant frequencies until they represent their content. So I'm going to do that here, but maybe on an R vowel. Like So you will encounter these concepts over the week. Partial tones, formants, which are the same thing as resonances, really. Spectrum slope. The harmonic series, which I only hinted at, but that's the... And where every frequency is the same distance from the previous one. And I'll be around all week, so you can just come and talk to me if you like.